All right, so I have the pleasure of talking to you guys today on behalf of Lucidity. It's a very, very cool ad tech company based in Los Angeles. I am here with my colleague Miguel Morales, who's one of the co-founders there, as well as two of our engineering colleagues sitting there on the audience. Alex, Darius, what's up? All right, so just a quick introduction on the agenda for today. We're going to quickly go through who Lucidity is, do a crash course on programmatic advertising, go through the problem that we're essentially seeing and trying to solve with our company, the solution that we've built to address this problem, and basically how this looks like on top of our chain. All right, so we started in September 2017. Lots of former ad tech specialists like Miguel and myself who worked together in a previous company, as did probably a third of the company. We have today like 30 members worldwide, and we're working closely with the IAB, the body that governs lots of the standards around the digital advertising industry. We're part of the blockchain steering committee, and we're working closely with them on standards and protocols. So first, a crash course in programmatic advertising, essentially all the questions that you guys wanted to know but never had the courage to ask. First thing is that we have two types of actors here. On one side, you can think that we have the buy-side actors. First, you have the advertiser. That's essentially the people who want to put their brand out there or to get people into their websites, to get people to buy their products. And the way that this works is that they will issue an order to an agency. The agency is going to set up a campaign, is going to create the ads, is going to set up the audiences and everything. And they're going to set up and track this into a DSP, a demand-side platform. So these are the companies that are actually doing the technology-intensive part of the buy side. On the sell side, you're going to have the publisher. This is the person who's actually authoring the apps and sites that you guys use and love every day. And they're also integrating with the exchanges, which are the companies that broker access between apps and sites and the advertisers all the way on the other side. Cool. This is what is actually happening when you see an ad on your device. So every time you open up a web page or app and there is a little ad showing up there, what's happening is that this is in real time making an ad request to an exchange that is auctioning off this position to a number of interested DSPs. This all happens very, very fast, within 50 to 100 milliseconds, and happens in tens to hundreds of thousands of requests per second, even for relatively small exchanges. The DSP is in real time making a decision of whether they are interested in buying that particular slot to show an advertisement. They're selecting a suitable advertisement for that slot, returning the bid to the exchange, and should they be the winner, that bid is going to return to the device in the form of an ad response. This includes the ad tag, the actual code that renders the ad, as well as any tracking information. All of this happening again within a few tens of milliseconds at hundreds of thousands of times per second. Boom. Signal tracking. So everyone wants to know what's going on. Like everyone wants to know about the clicks, impressions, interactions with that ad, essentially everything that is going on there. We have the deceptively simple signals, such as impressions and clicks, pretty simple to understand. And we have the more interesting signals, which are also very, 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 very valuable. So there you have your viewable impressions, your want impressions. Those are signals that actually depend on the combination of multiple signals to happen in a very specific way within a very specific semantics that allow you, for instance, to determine whether an advertisement was actually seen by a human being or was victim to fraud or some untoward behavior. This is happening out of order, very, very complex semantics on a lot of those events, and they usually have a high aggregated value. Cool. Now the problem, like this all sounds really, really cool inside the lab, but when you go to reality, what actually happens is that none of those actors can agree on event counts. Nobody agrees on them. Everybody kind of measures them differently. And this is interesting because this is already a trustless system in the sense that nobody trusts anyone there. So you have players that have incentives to push and pull counts towards the outcomes that they prefer. And this leads to a lot of fraud happening there. You have like publishers that are going to stack ads to maximize impression counts. You have advertisers that are going to show ads that mine Bitcoin in the background. Maybe some of you have encountered those. And essentially, it just leads to a really bad user experience at the end of the day. And because of that, you have a very contentious relationship, if you will, between the different actors. So getting paid there is very, very difficult. You have lots of back and forth with reporting and data requests, people wanting to track their own signals with their own trusted third parties because they don't trust the signal counts from everyone else in the system. And getting paid there usually takes like 30 to 90 days. And it's a high attrition process a lot of the times. And the solution that we've built to address this problem is to create essentially a trust layer. What this means is that we have a decentralized protocol that we developed at Lucidity. This is currently running on top of the Ethereum blockchain as a side chain to deal with scaling issues inherently involved with Ethereum. And this creates a mechanism on which everyone is highly incentivized to behave and to agree fast on counts of all those signals that are coming and flying around in this ecosystem. And if they agree and they track and do a really good job at tracking and agreeing on those numbers, they get paid every hour. So instead of 30 to 90 days, you have consolidation happening almost on a soft real time in the context of ad tech, which is really good for everyone. Furthermore, this mechanism disincentivizes the bad players because if you have an app that clearly is doing like shady things, you're going to get voted out. You're not going to get paid on a timely fashion. And if you're an advertiser that is also not showing ads that have a really good user experience or that do untoward things towards your user, you're also going to be disincentivized out of the system. Cool. All right, now to my colleague, Miguel. Bring it home.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Marcelo. Yeah, I'm super honored to be here. Happy to be part of the RCON community. So yeah, as Marcelo mentioned, our first implementation was on top of Ethereum as a sidechain. As you know, Ethereum only supports about 15 to 20 transactions per second, not nearly enough to what we need, which is hundreds of thousands per second. So we did this layer 2. However, when we started researching into RChain, we think that it's actually possible to do this in layer 1 with RChain, which is pretty cool. Some of the features that RChain gives you, which I'll go through in the presentation. And so the point of this is to show how we're thinking of this in architecture-wise, how we're thinking of implementing this in the layer 1 to help validate RChain, and to make it a little bit easier so that we don't have to build as much on this layer 2. So let's go through that. Cool. So for the first iteration, we want to keep it a little bit simple. And we're creating one single namespace. Now you could break that up into more granular namespace, but for the first iteration, we're calling this a Lucidity Consortium namespace. What it is it's a consortium shard and a group of resources. So here you can see some of these resources. So you have the core of it, which is the tracking smart contract, which is connected to a participant registry smart contract. The tracking smart contract receives messages over named channels. So I've been talking about messages are basically, we call them events. So they're like impressions, clicks, conversions, so on. But in the RChain definition, it's called a message. So we send messages from the participants, send messages to the protocol directly, send over the name channels, and those goes to the, so one example is how does the data get into the system? So it goes through the tracking smart contract, which just processes it, and then I'll go into the details of that, stores the data in the key value storage for analytics, and then there is a proxy, so very similar to what we saw in RCON. There's a proxy. Right now, we're thinking of a smart contract. It might not be a smart contract, The point is there's a querying mechanism so that participants can get insights and access to that data. So here's what the registry looks like. So you have an ID, a role, and then some other metadata. Here I just have an example, public key, but it could be any other metadata that can augment the tracking signals coming in. So for example, I have some of the key participants, and some of these are actually participants that we're actively working with. So for example, AppNexus, WPP, and so on. So basically you have a role, so for example, an agency, and each role can send different types of signals. So an agency will have assigned to it an agency ID, and they can send impressions, clicks, conversions. A demand-side platform is deemed a DSP, and they can send wins and bids. Exchange can send bid decisions, and publishers send servings. Cool. All right. So this is like the heart of the system. So what it is a tracking system. And so as Marcelo mentioned, we're getting these events, hundreds of thousands of events per second. But the key thing is that this all happens. It can happen sequentially, but it may not. But it may happen out of order. In fact, it may happen all at the same time. And so here's where some of these parallelism features inherent to Roland are really key that we want to try to tap into, mainly around what Mike mentioned today, more granular locks in your key value story. So for example, here we have a session ID. So as data comes in, we have a lock on a session ID such that we don't introduce race conditions when two events, say, got in at the same time. So we're able to lock that data object by the session ID using Roland. And then we have a nice concurrent mechanism that deals with the parallelism of these signals coming in. So at the end of the day, we basically have a session that has all these different events to it. And so we're using the concurrent locks to be able to manage that as we get the data, basically at the same time. Yeah, so that's the session ID, the lock, and then the data coming in. So here you can see some of the signals that we get. So very important here, for example, the agency sends the impression, the DSP sends a win, exchange decision, and so on. So two that I want to focus on, just to give you some context for the next slide, is the agency and the viewability vendor. So these are viewability vendors, that basically measure the viewability. The point here is that we're getting two signals from two different parties, and what we're doing is here, this contract computes what is a billable metric. So what we're doing is we're basically taking standards like the IAB and others have defined and codifying them as a smart contract so that no one can cheat the rule, no one can change the rules as to what is a billable metric. No one can change this after the fact. Okay, so here's, so we're getting all this data, and naively we may store that data in a log or in a queue. And however, that would be extremely expensive, right? Even with our chain, because we're getting hundreds of thousands of signals per second, it would be extremely expensive to store that on chain. So what do? So we introduce the idea of time series aggregation. It's an optimization that we introduce. The basic idea here is that, as I mentioned before, each of these entities have an ID. So for example, agency ID, demand ID, exchange ID, publisher ID, and so on. So we introduce a date key. So basically, this becomes the key in a key value storage. So basically, you can say for this set of actors, this is what happened. And so as new events come in, basically we look up that key, and then we just add 1 to those metrics. So for example, the number of impressions, instead of adding a new impression as the new impressions come in, we simply add 1. So this becomes much more efficient, where it's basically bound by your number of unique entities in the system. So here's basically how we're able to deal with parallelism, to deal with high throughput, and we're actually able to store things on chain without losing basically any data or having to make sacrifices, because we're still be able to track the metrics. So a very important mechanism here is the compound metrics. So as I mentioned before, we get the impression signal from the agency and the viewability signal here, but together they make a viewable impression. And so ultimately, as we create this new type of billable metrics, that's the metric that the advertisers are going to pay on. And so that's kind of like the entire idea. So here I want to show two things: is the time series aggregation optimization and the compound metrics, and how that data looks on chain. Cool. And then here's just an example output. So a few slides back, you notice that there is a participant that can go and actually query this data. Here's what they will look at. So basically, you get a nice breakdown of, say, for example, for this campaign, for this exchange, for this agency, for this publisher, and so on, we had like 500 impressions, but maybe only 250 of those were viewable impressions. So they get a nice breakdown of the data, of the analytics, and full confidence that A, no one manipulated this data, and B, the rules for computing this data were not changed in any way. And then ultimately, we deal with payments. So as Marcelo mentioned, first we basically created a shared ledger. Then we created a mechanism for computing what is a billable metric. And then thirdly, we unlock payments. So here's where I think we think like the power of the blockchain really shines through, because first, you cannot manipulate how those billable metrics are computed, but then secondly, you can also unlock payments way faster than you would today. So basically, the advertiser deposits payments for a campaign. As the smart contract keeps track of all those events, it then sends payments from the advertiser to all the participants in the supply chain, bringing basically efficiency to payments in digital advertising. So not extremely, we're not dealing with users. It's not extremely you're not seeing anything that's super cool, but we're already making big waves with the biggest agencies, the biggest exchanges, and this is a real use case. We're tracking right now thousands of events per second, and so this is why we think that RCON makes a really, really attractive solution because it supports some of the things that we have to deal with, like parallelism, data storage, and throughput. So yeah, that's about it. Questions? Questions? Okay. Well, thank you. Yeah, we'll be around if you want to ask me offline.
That we're a streaming music co-op. We started in 2015, and then we're officially founded in 2017. And we're based in Ireland as a cooperative, but have a branch office here in Berlin. We were funded also by Reflective in March of this year, which seems about 3 years ago, but was just like 7 months. My background is in arts and music. I feel really fortunate that I spent most of my 20s playing around in film and fine arts and, as a singer-songwriter and then a DJ and producer, because all of these experiences have really fed into how the platform is being developed. I also had a career as a web developer for about 15 years, built hundreds of sites, had a special emphasis working with a lot of musicians, and so I got to hear a lot of incredible stories through the years, especially one close friend who co-wrote some songs on Santana's comeback albums and told me about how he had to wait 3 or 4 years to get some payments for co-writing some songs on a multi-platinum selling album. That was really interesting. And this web career started in 1999 at the peak of Napster, and it was really interesting. We had some clients that were massive superstars and some that nobody had ever heard of, and they all asked the same question: where are we going now that Napster is here? So these this kind of background and experience and stuff really just it got stored in the back and never really left. I had one previous startup to this. That's how I ended up in Berlin, and ironically also in streaming, and that was streaming yoga. And in a exciting or typical or cliched, maybe even in startup culture, I quit 1 week after we launched. So another key aspect of my background personally is being an organizer and activist, both doing events and political organizing and things like that. And I think that's really what fed into a lot of the structural things that Resonate's based on in the cooperative model is the, there's really a strong connection between looking at the rise of the platform capitalists, the Facebooks and Twitters and everything, and wanting to disrupt all of that, to disrupt the disruptors. So looking at the service and the community, the market share model is what Spotify and everybody else is based off. It's why there is such an inequitable distribution of payments. You think if you go and listen to a bunch of indie music on Spotify, that money is going to them, but it's actually not. It'll end up going to Drake and others on the other end of the spectrum because of the market share model. So it was in the early 2015 when I was looking at like, okay, we've got a streaming music co-op concept here as a bedrock, as a foundation. What's the listening model going to be? And that led to stream to own. And that was the idea that you could have the price of a download broken up over 9 streams in, starting off really cheap and then progressing as you become a real fan, which is a better economic model for the artists because if you look at the cost comparisons, it takes at least 200 to 300 plays on Spotify to equal the cost of a download. And I'm talking about repeat plays of the same exact song. So the economic model, while the whole industry shifted over to streaming, and there's all this applause about we're making money again, when you actually look at the economics of the whole thing, it's a lot of money lost to artists. So I'm really excited about the way we're going to develop in the future, because what we're going to, I think, see with the advent of the blockchain systems that get developed is the opportunity to do the subscriber share model, which is whereby you're paying still a monthly subscription, so you don't have to necessarily do, keep track of your bank balance as you do in Stream to Own, which is based on microcredits. But with subscriber share, what that does is you still pay a monthly fee, but it actually goes to the people whose music you're listening to. So if you listen to one artist one month, your whole monthly fee goes to that artist that month. And looking at the service and the community and how those overlap, it's really this philosophy that music is art and culture, it's not content. And that's really a fundamental element of how we view the service, the platform, and our members. We're starting out really focused on the independent market, and we'll deal with the majors later, I hope on our terms, which we have to get a lot in place in order to be able to pull that off. But things are going really well. We've joined quite a few of the independent trade associations and have close relationships with the main ones. Very excited that I'll be hopefully Friday or Monday, once I get time back on my laptop, to send our membership fee off to the new trade association in Japan, which has been newly formed. And so we've been doing lots and lots of outreach there. We've also started onboarding some distributors in the independent sector. And so we're well on our way to really address that market. And I think it's really key because if you look at some Nielsen research, it's appropriate for us. I'm going to talk about that in a bit. We got about 4,000 artists strictly by word of mouth, a little bit of press, and those numbers are already starting to explode very quickly. Because of some recent partnerships with some distributors. Cargo's one, and they've got like 12,000 artists. So we're well on our way to going after that independent sector. And that I mentioned, the Nielsen research, what's really key about the independent market is that in a few years ago, they put out a study that showed that the top 13% is responsible for about 24 to 27% of the spend. So there's a very top section of the listening market that is actually responsible for about 1/3 of all sales across all the verticals in the industry, and they're the super fans. And what do they want to do? They want active discovery. They don't want to be force-fed via an algorithm what the new music is. They want to go out and find it. So they're very active. They're not passive listeners. And the other key thing that was a part of that research is that they discovered that there was an additional $500 million to $2 billion on the table if there were bundling options, if you were able to combine different offerings into one, whether that's, let's say you've bought an album and so then you get some exclusive content as bonus, or if you were to buy an album and get a discount on a ticket, or let's say you stream a bunch of music and you get a discount on a t-shirt. And so this bundling feature, wink, wink to a friend over there, is something that I think is a tremendous opportunity that hasn't really been explored in the digital space very much. And I'm really looking forward to how we're going to be rolling out some new opportunities in that regard to really address the needs and desires of the super fans. So now let's look at blockchain, the fun stuff. This is why we're here. Show of hands, how many people saw the keynote this morning? most everybody. Cliff, I apologize about that. I'll tell you later why that didn't happen. Yeah, so there's some fun stuff coming up with the blockchain integrations. Obviously, the keynote today was about audio on chain. This is an absolutely massive leap forward. If you've heard the demo, if you don't have full context on what's gone on in the music and blockchain space in the last few years, one of the songs on the demo is Tiny Human by Imogen Heap. And this was the first song to be sold on-chain years ago via Ethereum. And the bulk of that offering was about being able to split the payments among all of the creatives on the song as the song was purchased. And Imogen's very grateful for that because she made a ton of money, because I think Ethereum was about $5 at that time. So it was a very worthwhile venture. But it was just about the purchase, and it was just about the payment to the artists. Now we have audio on chain. And we have this because of the architecture of our chain. With Ethereum, you've got one chain for everything, and that means transaction and storage is, it's either on chain, which is insanely expensive. They estimate around 10 grand to host a song on the Ethereum blockchain. Or you'd have to split things off. I've been talking in this space for years now, and the model was always, we'll do the smart contract stuff on Ethereum, and then we'll put the files over on IPFS, and they'll link up together, and then we'll have this magic world of music on blockchain. Well, that's not the case with our chain. We have the ability to put both the transactional element through the smart contract as well as the files on the same node, and that's because you don't have to push the audio file through consensus, and that's just a massive breakthrough. We are working also with a bunch of partners on a catalog pilot project. We're focused really, again, in the independent space. We've got a bunch of key labels around the world that are participating in a pilot called Invoke. And it's an attempt to really meet the needs of this sector and to first focus on metadata. Later, we'll bridge the gap to bring in the audio on-chain as well. And it's another great example of how to exploit the architecture of our chain, because we're going to use a federated validation and staking model with the independent sector, whereby you've got different nodes acting as stewards, data stewards, and then for every node and every steward, you get a governance seat in a new global cooperative, which will then facilitate the design, execution, and delivery of the platform over time. So we're starting very, very basic in the beginning, which is to bring together a bunch of labels from around the world. Very excited that we've got folks from Brazil, the US, very close to Japan and China coming in. And I just got news today about Ethiopia. And the idea there is to try to get as many different character sets in as possible so that we're really international from the beginning. So that's underway, and I'm really grateful for the collaboration with Marita Sussex from Stolen Recordings, who's on the Merlin board, to execute that and bring that into being. So another blockchain integration that we're working on is our partnership with Imogen, as I mentioned, and the Mycelia Creative Passport. I wore the Music Tech Fest t-shirt today, which is because there's a workshop happening in Stockholm right now, a hackathon working on the Creative Passport, and this represents the beta launch of the Creative Passport in Sweden as we speak. In real time, because everything on our chain is happening in real time, including the launch of the testnet this morning, which was one of the most undramatic things I've ever seen. He said, and now I'm going to push enter, and the testnet will launch. And then it's launched. And it was like completely silent in the room, because it was like the most boring thing ever. I know. I expected the Spake Thursday to be like, piping into this. Yeah, somebody could have timed that well. Anyway, the Creative Passport's really exciting and interesting because it's a new form of identity. It's a new model for identity. And the way it basically works is it's self-sovereign. So you assert your identity, and then you link up to the people that are in your network, and they attest to who you are. So I know about a third of the people in this room, and so I can attest to the identities of those folks, and they do the same for me. And then the really interesting technical bit that is super close to being really, really finalized, it's going to, like I said, it's still in beta, is the idea that we'll be able to shard and back up both your profile as well as all your key information through your network, so that if you have come onto the platform through one particular device and you've made all of your connections, and then you lose that device and have to get another one, that you can come back in and get signed back into the network and reclaim your ID through your network. So it's going to take a few months to evolve, I'm sure, but that's the direction that it's heading in. Mycelia as an organization is working to be a link for artists and creatives in and out of other services, and the future of that looks really interesting. I think of it as a meta-social network, and it's sort of the really inverting the Facebook login model. Instead of using your Facebook ID to log into sites, and then Facebook starts tracking your patterns and habits and data around all of that, by inverting that model with this new form of identity, you can move in and out of other services, and there's no tracking mechanism that's following those actions. And then finally, the next area for development for us in blockchain is the culture token. And don't know how much I want to say about that legally yet, because I'm still waiting on some advice from various jurisdictional authorities. But I will say that what we hope to do with it is to be able to create a nice utility function for the network around sharing and consumption and curation, all the main things that you'd find in a music community, and to be able to move those transactions on chain and make them direct and make them about the people that are using them. At the most basic level, you think about following an artist, and the go-to example that I always reference is when SoundCloud had their funding crisis last year, and Twitter was flooded with messages where artists were saying, "What's going to happen to my followers if this goes out of business? I'm going to lose all of them." And so a little thought went back into my brain. It was like, well, wait a minute. If you were doing that on chain, and those followers were, between those people, theoretically that's permanent as long as it exists on the chain. And so that's where we're going to focus a lot of the way that the service is going to develop, is about those relationships, and that making it as direct as possible. And it's an interesting challenge too, from an organizational perspective, because you have to think differently about your business model and how you're interacting with everyone, and ultimately it ends up being about permission and asking for it instead of just taking it. So there's some details. I think I've had too much coffee because I've talked incredibly fast, but that's good because we've only got 4 minutes left. Nora's got a question.
So, am I correct that Mycelia is being developed in conjunction with Life ID, or are they separate projects that might have some interplay?
There's a lot of collaboration that's going on between the two. Life ID is a self-sovereign identity service, open source. It's a nonprofit foundation. They're working on standards even outside of our chain on a cross-chain kind of basis. And so, there's been a lot of discussions, especially as it relates to this idea of the identity social graph and backing up your information across your network. So, she's got another question.
That $2 billion we're talking about,
Yeah.
that's potential, that's only if we capture the top 13% of that Nielsen research, right?
It's about that market share or that segment.
But that's only with that section, though.
Yeah, and then if you go down to the next block, the numbers are so close that I often get them mixed up, but it's like the next segment down is around 20%, and I think it's like 24% of the spend, so it's another big block, and they called them digital fans. And so those were kind of, you know, you might think of them as somebody that is, you know, really heavily a user in one of the services, the digital services, and maybe they're a bit more passive rather than active in terms of discovery, but they're fully digital, and they're also still spending a lot of money. They're also still going to shows. So there's really quite a lot out there for the big segments. You know, this whole myth that nobody's spending money on music just really has to be put to rest. It's just not true. People are buying music all the time. They're buying it in many forms. It's not as clear-cut as it used to be. It's not as driven through a single object as it used to be, but it's still lots and lots of money is being spent. So 2 more. I'll go to the back, and you had your hand up first.
Thanks. Hello. You told us about some nice big artists who are pushing their own artwork. But how to deal with those who will use your network for fraud, for selling others' artwork?
Yep.
So for misbehaving artists,
Yeah.
so-called artists.
Yeah. This is really fundamental to the architecture of Invoke and how it's designed, and that we're going to go through several transition stages before it could possibly get to that at the end. And so for the first stage, the publishing right access is going to be extremely limited. We also need to, you know, time for the Creative Passport to propagate, and the way that happens is that it's person to person, you know. It's you have to know somebody that's going to be in order to get in and to use it, and so it's that plus a lot of more complex mechanisms, staking mechanisms that I think need some time to get sorted out. So it's stages, but absolutely everything's being designed to prevent, you know, to make sure that a teenager in Omaha or Manila is not uploading, you know, again, I used Drake as the example. Sorry, Drake. Do you have a follow-up, quick one?
So the second question is, why do you need cryptocurrency? Why not to use the real bucks?
Oh, we do. Yeah, when it comes to paying for music, it's all fiat. Which is one of the huge separators between us and other music on blockchain services, is that we're not focused on consumption via crypto. The use of our token is really utility in nature. It's about publishing and transactions inside the network, but not for paying artists for music, because you can't pay for a song one day at 10 cents, $1 the next day, and then a half a penny, you know, 2 weeks from now. That just doesn't fly. So you have a quick one, and I think we got to wrap up pretty quick. Yeah.
I'd love to hear, just brief, but your 10-plus year vision of what you hope to accomplish, 25 years or whatever you want to say. What's the big vision? What's your ambitious?
I can't say that I've projected out 10 years ahead. I mean, 5 years ahead, I hope that there's no CEO for Resonate. I hope that nobody has to follow me. I hope that we're able to decentralize the organization itself so efficiently that the technology and the organizational structure itself can help kind of dissolve out so that it doesn't need to run that way, because it's too much of a threat. I mean, more on the culture side even than on the business side. The business side's safe because of the co-op, but culturally, the possibility of re-centralizing control over how this is supposed to work. You don't want one person at the apex of that. You know, we've got a board that all key, you know, important decisions have to be voted through by the board, and the board can be elected by the community. But still, the chance of corruption is too strong. So I haven't projected out 10 years. I hope I'll be doing something else in 5. Making movies, maybe. I think we got to wrap up because there's going to be another, or maybe it's break time. And then there's another thing coming up at 3:15. So, you know, feel free to follow out with me and ask more questions outside. Thank you so much.